The only one who's been listening to the president in the last hour. I'm joined now by Pheli Sankomo. She's a development economist and social justice activist. Pheli Sankomo, good afternoon. What stood out for you in what the president said? For me, among other things, was his strong condemnation of us as men who continue to perpetuate violence against women and children in our society.
Well, thank you so much, Baden, and good afternoon to the listeners. I hope you can hear me because I'm actually here at Gallagher Estate where President was just addressing a second ago. I mean, I think for me, I agree with you. I think firstly, the speech for me was really, there was a lot of honesty and candidness in as far as the weaknesses. And I think the fact that he was actually quite open about the institutional weaknesses of the state in as far as implementing and honoring the commitment made within the NSP. I think that's the first issue. I think the second issue, one of the other things as well, I agree with you. I mean, this question for me where he had taken at least a good 3.5 minutes in the last part of his speech, where he's actually really deconstructing the issue, the question of patriarchy and the masculinity and the benefits associated with that. And the fact that, in fact, he is now openly taking leadership around the need for conversations with men, right? In fact, the first 2 paragraphs of his speech, he makes the point that, by the way, gender-based violence, it's not a women's issue because it's not women who commit, violence against themselves. It's actually men who commit violence against women. So in fact, those who are violent should actually take responsibility. So I thought for me, again, from a social and consciousness perspective, I thought that clarion call was actually quite good, very clearly. And then, in fact, it sends a very clear message to men in South Africa and even in Africa that, in fact, women's lives matter and that, in fact, they need to take responsibility for their violent behavior in society. I think the other issue which was candid about was the fact that there is very limited institutional framework in as far as reporting and, in fact, that around also clear implementation of the NSP, right? And I thought for me that was actually quite good. In fact, I suppose, civil society organizations are actually really welcoming that reflection. The biggest one was around the issue of funding, right? And where he makes a difference and says, and he felt compelled that what happened to the 1.6 billion that was actually allocated 18 months ago, and now what is the plan? Obviously, he explained that actually the 1.6 billion was actually a scratch on the surface, which in fact that was a question we were raising as well as the civil society organization. But now then he comes back and he says 21 billion will be allocated. There's going to be very clear reporting supported by the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, which I think for me that's excellent, right? So I think that there are a combination of interventions here which are really around both the leadership component, the resourcing, right, the accountability, but also fundamentally be that leader who says violence is actually not good for our society. Men, organize yourselves and actually take responsibility for violence that you actually inflict against women and children in South Africa.
Yeah, and he challenged society, challenged himself, his own ministers and other political leaders, religious leaders, sports people, as he said, artists, business leaders, and many others to participate in various dialogues in outreach, in creating awareness around this issue of gender-based violence. I think the president is basically saying it's going to be up to us, it's up to us as men to actually end GBV.
True. In fact, at the heart of his speech as well, he's saying collaborative approaches are going to be critical for us to deal with gender-based violence. One of the things he actually touched very clearly, which is the point we're making, in fact, it's around the theory of change around the NSP. Because at the heart of it, the theory of change argues that we must actually deal very, very distinctly with the issue of social norms and how there's a division of labor in society, which sometimes actually undermines women to be able to play an effective role, right, particularly in the economy. He's also saying that man, I am not going to be able to deal, as the leader of this country, to be able to deal with gender-based violence without you. I'm actually bringing you on the table, right? I want you to be part of the conversation. The other thing that I like as well is the localization of this conversation, because, I mean, you know that sometimes when you talk about gender-based violence or any form of social scourge, more often than not, the focus is always on the metros because there's so much activism. In fact, because by design, it's so right-orientated. So I like the fact of local conversations and the role of provinces, that premiers must actually hold the space and facilitate that. But at the same time, ordinary citizens like yourselves, Brian, that in fact, at a family level now, he is actually saying that you need to start speaking to your siblings, you need to speak to your nephews, you need to speak to your community about gender-based violence and the fact that, in fact, it's actually not right for women to live in fear, and that if for any other reason you feel the need for you to beat a woman or to actually kill a woman, then you need to be able to deal with yourself. But now here's the next leg where, by the way, we need to then deal with at a public institutional level. It's when men are coming out, because there's a trauma linked to men inflicting pain. So you probably know the saying that hurting people hurt others. So, and that's why most of the time it's easy for men to actually hurt women, because they believe that they are second-class citizens and in fact they are softer in society, and then they target them. So in essence, so what then needs to happen is that there needs to be institutions that are actually getting resourced to support that process. And meaning that in the same way that there's a demand for supporting Tutuzela centers, there must be spaces for men to be able to go into, institutions where they can talk about the trauma and the reasons for actually gender-based violence. I mean, for instance, if you look at, and just to, digress a bit, but it's an important digression. If you look at the data of children who got pregnant during COVID, right? I mean, the child rape actually indicates very strongly that, in fact, children at home are sitting with rapists. And now the key question you must then ask and say, so who breeds rapists? It's a society. Now, men must really start talking about it. But it's also his clarion call is even opening up such an interesting thing about masculinity and men as individuals, but then that men must start speaking about their pain. When you're going to go through pain, there is nothing wrong to talk about it. In fact, being vulnerable actually is part of a healing process. And women do that, by the way, through using existing social capital. And that's why there's always been a very clear demand that you need to strengthen Tutuzela centers, but also you need to strengthen, spaces where, in fact, women could come and speak. Now, it's actually good. Now, we know that we're not going to be able to deal with gender-based violence, against women when men are not part of the conversation, the healing journey, but also at the same time, other institutions needs to come into the party. Amongst those is access to justice and institutions that are responsible for creating economic opportunity.
Now, Pelisa, we're beginning to lose you. I know you are in Gallagher Estate and you are participating in the conference. But before I let you go, finally, if you may, very briefly, the president has spoken. You've sort of touched on some of the key aspects, what stood out for you. So now this is day one. There'll be more discussions into day two. For you, as a social justice activist, what will determine the success of this summit? What would make you say after tomorrow, this has been a successful summit?
Resource allocation for community-based organizations who are doing work and frontline work on a daily basis within communities. That's the first issue. The second issue is alignment within the public sector in as far as gender-based violence responses. The third one is a reporting infrastructure that, in fact, is going to use for us to assess the progress that we're making, but also thirdly is to actually build this movement where men are actually committing to speak about gender-based violence in society in collaboration with women at community level.
Thank you very much, Peli Sankomo. She's a social justice activist. She's a development economist, and I also know that she chairs Oxfam in the NGO Oxfam here in South Africa. Thank you for your time. We'll let you go now so you can go back and listen to what's happening more on this day one of this second presidential summit on GBV and femicide. President had very strong words for you and me and many other men in this country, and describing our barbaric acts of GBV as a shameful indictment of the men of this country. It is indeed a national disgrace, and he's saying that it cannot be anything but our foremost priority. So you and I as men have to do something to stop GBV once and for all.